I'll start with a poem called Heligoland, which was Joyce's way of saying Helgoland. And it's associated with Hensenberg, who went there when he was, his head was moithered from doing very hard sums. He was found in quantum mechanics. And he went to Helgoland. Interestingly, Joyce has a reference to it, Heligoland with its one tree. Now, I kind of like places with just the one tree because I'm from Connamara. And I'm sort of frightened of trees, basically. And but he went there because he had to get away from his, either, I suspect, asthma, but they always say hay fever. You wouldn't go anywhere to get away from hay fever, would you? And to think through, and he looked at the sea a lot and came up with what would eventually, along with all the other physicists involved, become the basis of wave mechanics, which clearly I know all about. And this is my attempt to understand it. But one of the lovely things is there's a reference to the necessary angel, and that's from a poem by Wallace Stevens. And I've taken the trouble to take this small quote, and I won't introduce the other poems, but I feel I have to in this case, from Stephen's poem, which is something I find enormously real and true. I am the necessary angel of earth, since in my sight you see the earth again, cleared of its stiff and stubborn, man-locked set. So we'll see what happens. Heligoland. Take God throwing life in faint outline, just blocking it in all the time in the world. Out of the box of light a single photon escapes, a tiny sun in a dark universe. It charges on like a bold child and spreads itself out. It whips along the curves and tunnels of this new racetrack until it meets a rose and slows down, enchanted. Then the necessary angel shifts her gaze. Space curls around her like a mink wrap. A river of particles rushes towards her and moves on. They sparkle. Heisenberg slips past, headed for Heligoland. When he looks back, there's a red rose pinned to the angel's cloak. For weeks he can't sleep. He will spend his first days on the archipelago, jotting it down, filling it in, riding the waves where they take him, to the cloak, the electric river, the impossible rose. Thank you. A folk tale. And there's a quote from Spencer at the beginning of this poem, who would know all about what the subject of the poem is. Days there is hideous chaos in the world. The iron wolf is lonely. His brothers are dead, and though they fought, he misses them. Some say he killed them, but we miss what we destroy. Now he is howling in his lair, trying to devour his god. When he succeeds, he will have no one. He will call to his god when the world rots in his metal teeth. He will cry for the time when a star spoke from the mouth of his cave. Thank you. This book is quite informed. There's a section in the middle that's really a section of lockdown poems. So a lot of the poems weren't written in lockdown, but they were, some of them were completed during it, and of course some of them which were, as happens, perhaps first drafts during lockdown were finished afterwards. But some of them were written indeed well before it, but not quite perhaps finished to my satisfaction for the last book. One of the things that happened during lockdown was that we lost people to whose funerals we could not go. And one of those was Ivan Boland, to whom I owe a great deal, and it was very important to me. A very fine poet, but also a very fine intellectual, she was able to take the temperature academically and intellectually and critically in a way that was utterly accessible. And she was one of the most democratic poets I've ever known in that sense. And she was very, very, very good to me. And the day I heard of her death, I was in the field on my own because that was the only place you really could be. And this is what happened. What do you do when somebody like that dies? Sit still now. Take up your pen. In this space, before noise begins, tigers are visiting cities, and a white leopard sits on a lawn in suburbia. A wolf is walking along an empty beach in California. A poet sings his traces. Now she too is becoming history. Already the first slow movement of the strings is parting silence. This is the point in the story when shadows thin as blades quiver in the April air. You can see the wolf through them. Soon he too will be gone, forgotten. This long, free walk by the sea, a detour. The sea will remember him. When he licked my hand at the hawthorn, his traces sharpened the salt air. I wasn't going to read this, but I'm going to read it from Marina. She's very fond of the rat. I've written about the rat before. He's a useful little fellow. I'm not too fond of them myself. And I don't see them very much, but they're there. And this rat, as Marina said, he's upset because he didn't get to, he didn't get any mention. They really don't get very good press anyway. And I'll read two, I'll perhaps have to read the three poems that go together, because in fact, this is quite a serious issue, that these poems, the occasion of these poems was something unpleasant that happened in a place near where I live. Person. I believe in the changeling with his limp and the gimp of the devil on the back of the horse he rides in on. A leg or an eye is the price of the gift. I believe in the rat, in his thin tail and the chained cat that will try and fail to destroy his ministry. Worship him and study him, for he will overcome. They come from the river where they slide and collide, their eyes sharp in case one gets a jot more than another. Their fights are rat fights, rat tactics, bites full of poison and suspicion. Citizen. The small man reels across the street, walks the careful steps of a robot. He is afraid that one night soon he will fall over and into the gutter to rust unless he takes action. He goes home to his room. Invasion, he writes. Do not be fooled. They are taking over our once proud nation. All the dark matter of the universe will fly to his tweet and coalesce. The people march and light bonfires. Driving through, faces scan for non-believers. Small eyes glint in the headlights. The river threatens to overflow. It teems with sleek brown bodies, squeaking hate. Rat. That's only half the story. I see your carcasses in the gutter. Your leavings choke the seas and the rivers are poisoned. I am a descendant of the rat that ate the vellum of the Book of Leinster without salt and found nourishment. He had them dated, authenticated. He was a legend in our family. They could have thanked him, but not even a mention in the footnotes. I better read Google Town because it's a ballad, and I'm going to spare you the singing. one of the things that happened during lockdown is something that was already well underway became a final hinge, a sort of door on one world shut and one era perhaps, and another, well, was made complete, and that was the world of social media and so on. And as opposed to, well, anyway. This is called the Ballad of Google Town. It was written long before lockdown, actually, about 2 years before, but I hadn't finished it. But I hadn't published it, my last book, because it wasn't finished. And it's exactly as it was, except that the final stanza came to me during one of those periods of lockdown when everybody was trying to be housewife of the year, except me, and learning 5 new languages, except me, and being very creative, except me. And I was desperately Googling viruses and finding them in the Iliad and Eliot's Lot and Eliot's Wasteland after he got the brain fever and so on. The Ballad of Google Town. The cars are in the drive and the bees are in the hive. There are no birds in the sky in Google Town. There's no God there, up there on high, but the cash machines don't dry. There are hearts and flowers to buy in Google Town, Google Town. There are 2 cars in the drive and there's 1 man left alive. He's not prepared to shrive in Google Town. There's fracking on the hill and the camera roams at will. It's all orderly and still in Google Town, Google Town. The cars are in the drive and the bees are in the hive. They say the kids are safe inside in Google Town, where they shop on Amazon buying handbags by the ton, or the latest shoes or guns in Google Town, Google Town. The man is dancing out of tune, shouting I'm the promised one, beating on a drunken drum in Google Town. He's following his own sweet light. Now he's burning fast and bright. He won't last another night in Google Town. And before I read before I forget, and before I read the last, well, or maybe second last poem, but before Marina we open for conversation, I want to say how wonderful it is to be back in Kennys, and to thank all of the Kennys who are still here. And that's the fantastic thing as well, to be somewhere where the shop is going on from generation to generation, changing as needs, as it always has done, and coming out on top every time. And where it was wonderful to walk in and see Tom, but also to see Sarah at the Moss. I want to especially thank Dean for all the work he's done.
Well done.
Thank you. And I want to thank Marina, despite the superlatives, because I don't think anybody knows my work as well, really. Or certainly not the conversations underneath it, that's for sure. And it was generous, Marina. I know how busy you are, and you know how busy you are. Thank you. And thanks very much. So I finished this section with a poem that was actually commissioned by Poetry Ireland for the Irish nation. It was a public commission, that's what I mean. And I have the Irish part of me, going back to the sort of old ways, believes in the notion that the poet also has, at certain times, the notion of the public voice. So in a way, it's a public voice poem, which is quite rare for me. But I'll read it because I want to read it for all of the people, just to remind us, I suppose, of what matters. It was commissioned for the occasion of the National Day of Remembrance and Reflection, if you don't mind, in March 2022, to mark the end of lockdown, really. And I called it The Lucky Ones because we are the lucky ones. Dystopia is sudden. The whisper from Wuhan swelled to a rumour. By St. Patrick's Day we were stone cold sober. Most kept terror a hair's breadth away with uneasy humour. but from long habit I was uncertain and afraid. Soon we were zooming on empty pews, silent as if we too were absent. Still, the swallows arrived from their warm galaxy. They cut windows in the sky and raised our flat world up like a blue circus tent. There are limits to living by proxy. Though the poppies lasted all that summer, and the weight of their beauty on its frail stems was almost too much to bear, the dead rustled like leaves in the air. But beauty and the new life pushing up out of the mulch history leaves under our feet is what gets us through. That, and what most call love and some call tomorrow. Madsen mach the gausamach. The voices we've lost echo. Nobody thrives on separation, but we're lucky, we say. Even so. A few small boys explode onto a pitch, spinning, their faces all like new suns, learning their orbits on the hop of a bowl. Then time snaps back. The air is charged with fumes and rust, and suddenly it's over. The past, the future, not the past, is in the ascendant. Hope is out of the box again, a hair rising to its full height, ears tuned to some satellite older than the moon. She sniffs the air, a twitch, and we're off, complaining, a bit stiff, but tumbling into the wonderful mess of an ordinary night, sitting at one another's tables. The shades of our dead hungrily joining the conversation. The days opening ahead. Thank you.
Well, there's a taste. Wonderful taste. Mary, where did you get your ideas from?
Monsters. The sleep of reason produces monsters. Indeed, as we in the poems. But I think also just getting out of one's own way, and I found particularly at that period of lockdown when we're in our own heads. I mean, poets are in their own heads anyway. Enough, too much maybe. We're alone. It's a very lonely job, to be honest. So we need to meet people. We need to be let out every so often. But all of us do. I think it can be hard to get out of your own viewpoint and to realise. That's why the Heligoland is so important to me. That notion of quantum mechanics. Because actually what they discovered was that Newtonian logic, if you like, how they thought things were going to be, wasn't at all. And that things were probable, improbable. And the improbable happened. In fact, the impossible happened in a lot of cases. And so I love that notion that we don't know everything, and sometimes we know very, very little, and the older some of us get, the less we know. Because it allows, as well as a certain humility, it allows it also allows for beauty and discovery, and a kind of holding on to innocence. You know, I mentioned I'd read a lot of Blake during that period again, and I had loved Blake when I was a teenager. And I love him again. Differently, because that's what time does as well.
Yeah. And I know you're a big Blakean, and just touching on time, which permeates the book, and your journey with time and your conversation around time. And there's a fantastic poem which you didn't read about the excavations. This someone coming and after we're all gone and picking. Maybe you might read it in a while. But the Blakean notion of time, which we've spoken about, the time being, what did he say, merely a construct of the fallen world, that we've invented it. And therefore we should be very suspicious of it.
And they're now discovering, in terms of physics, that in fact we should be even more suspicious of it, because it's not, I'm sure it exists, because we have to, without it, you know, it's just bonkers. But at the same time, it doesn't exist. The fact that we have to put a certain, the man-made set on it, doesn't mean that's its only function or that's how it is. I think that's what I find so wonderful, actually, that there are other possibilities, and they're not all human-centered, you know.
Yeah, and I suppose the circular nature of time as well, how time works in our memories, and how time works in poetry. You know, you have a lot of the persona you have through these poems. They're animal, or they're creatures from another world. They're creatures out of dreams, and it seems that you pay great attention to your dream life, to your nightlife. There's a lot happening,
Especially during lockdown, when I had no other life.
Yeah. I find that very interesting, because there are some poets who really take that seriously. Like Yeats took that seriously, Ted Hughes took that really seriously.
Yeah.
Do you know? But you kind of pick them out, and you can see it. You can see it in the work. You can see the dreamer in the writer, and it's that's a lot of hard work, though. I mean, that's a lot of craft work.
Well, you have to, yeah, because the dream, I think in some ways, if you let it, it's how certain things get in. You know, the cracks that lets the light in, as it were, and it lets the dark in.
Yeah, and I suppose navigating.
And then it's up to the poet, I suppose. That's our job, to make a poem out of it, rather than to just slap it down, you know, in Jungian delight or whatever. Although that might be an idea sometimes, but I don't think you'd want to read it. Yeah, I mean, you must find that in your work, because it's a great deal of...
It's a bit different. It's a bit different.
Different for the stage, yeah.
I would love more of it. You know, like the poem about the room filling up with swans, and you know, the demons visiting. I mean, they're straight out of dreams, those poems, aren't they?
They're.
Those images.
That was a direct image from a dream.
Yeah.
The house just filled with swans.
Yeah, and it's incredibly vivid.
Yeah.
You know, and
not threateningly, you know. It's just
and really beautiful image, and there are several images in the book like that. And I suppose my question is, as the writer, how important do you think that is? I mean, because that's kind of gold being handed to you in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, but then you have to do something with it.
You do,
you know?
Yeah. But the image,
like
that
if
is
you
golden
keep a
image.
dream notebook, you know, as I often ask students to do, and some people are against it, of course. There's a school and a counter school for everything. I pay no heed much. But I think the question is really, you're getting the material, and then what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
You know, whatever the exercise might be. And I, maybe with experience, but I go through phases where I don't want to listen to any dreams, and I don't even remember them. And others where they're very persistent. You know, there's a persistence to certain things, they keep coming back.
Yeah. But you
you know
use them very subtly in the work. Because, you know, let's
I
face
hope
it,
so.
there's nothing more boring than someone saying, "Can I tell you the dream now?" No, go away from me.
Exactly.
But they're so embedded in your vocabulary, and that's well, to me that's a real achievement. Do you know?
Thank you.
Just the excavation.
I mean, if you look at how Yeats used dream as well, you know, or if you look at the old Irish poems, and I think that's where a lot of magic realism, which is very natural to anybody who has any connection with the Irish language, it's not even a notion, it's there. It's how stories were. There was a surreal part of there's a surreal, I think part of the Gaelic imagination was surreal, if that's not a big statement, as has been said before. But there is we have been battered so much into by so-called rational thought, and it's killing us, literally, at the moment, I think, killing a lot of people. But then you can't just vomit it out either. I mean, you have to do something with it. I think no matter what the material is, whether it's paint, whether it's words, you really have to hone your craft as best you can to make something out of it. Does that make any?
Yeah, it does. And you know, you're very into myth as well, Irish myth and Greek myth.
So you,
yeah. And you know, I suppose I'm very, very interested in the relationship, I suppose, between the sacred and the secular. You know, and I think your work posits itself between those two. And that's a very difficult thing to do, I think. Do you know, and that is to carry the line through and to take the reader with you, or to take the poem to its conclusion, incorporating the sacred. And I'm just wondering what the sacred in these secular times, what it means for you and for any of us.
The first thing is, I think this is a particular problem of English. I think it's much harder, easier to do in Irish than in English. And I think it's probably easier in Spanish, as I'm reading of other Spanish poetry. They don't have the same terror of the sacred, it seems to me, as has become the case in English. Or the same fear that it'll be identified with a religion, or the same fear that you'll be accused of being a Catholic or a Muslim or a whatever, Hindu or something. I just think that the entire human, is quite a complex and precious thing, and this is part of what we need to thrive. And certain things simply are sacred. I expect a lot of them are enthroned in religions, but mine are enthroned mostly in human beings. You know, I still remember seeing those first children's faces after lockdown. Those first children that they did explode onto that pitch. And just little kids, and I remember thinking, that's what they mean by the host. Literally, it just came to my mind, you know. And so I can't even imagine a world where I don't know why one would deny the sacred. You know, there's sacred space. Even Larkin, hardly a religious nut. Philip Larkin has wonderful poems that talk about sacred space, actually.
And the I suppose landscape then is huge in work, and your relation to landscape is well, that's through all the work, Mary, isn't it? It's just a continued.
It's there. It's the scenery.
It's the scenery, yeah. And
not as Lord Fortune knows it.
Not as Lord Fortune. Yes, and can I ask you, and this may be a bit of a contentious question, the West in the imagination, in the Irish imagination, what that is, because we all have our fantasies about the West of Ireland, and particularly Connamara, and not just the Irish imagination. In anyone who knows anything about Ireland or Irish literature, eventually they're going to discover the West, and in the literature, if not through the landscape. And what does that mean for someone who is actually from the West? How do you navigate that fantasy or fetishization, however you pronounce that word, of the West?
Yes, at different points, different ways, I suppose. I'm writing, or not writing at the moment, a book of essays which is exploring that whole thing, and the relationship of what happens to a place when all the locals are driven out or gone, and it's become a tourist destination. And I think that applies just as much to the south of Spain, where I go and love, to Andalusia, as it does to Connamara. And so where is the place now? What has always interested me. Mostly, of course, it's, even when I was a child, we knew that it was in Boston, Chicago, New York, London, you know, wherever the people had gone to work. That's where the West was. The music, for example, Irish music that we so treasure nowadays. But that was mostly kept alive. I mean, a lot of the musicians I've worked with and know, their fathers and mothers and parents taught them in London. They're back here living now, and well-known people and names in Chicago, in New York, in Boston. So I think the landscape, the place, the West travels, luckily for us, largely in story and music. I suppose that's how place does travel. So then you have the people who come in and write about Connamara, and I read about this wonderful place. It sounds fabulous. it sounds absolutely interesting and quite wild in ways, and there are natives, or locals, sorry, they call them. And you know, the people who write about it love it, and it is it's very real what they're writing about. It's just that I've never been there, and actually I couldn't afford to live there at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think this must be true in every tourist destination, you know, all over the world. So I am very careful when I have, as I have Spain in my poems. I stick to my Lorca, or I stick to my Machado, whom I'm currently obsessed with, and Jimenez, the two southern Spanish poets that I'll be working on some translations of, or versions of. But also I have to say, in the defence of the people who come in and whose, you know, whose world it is, I went to Andalusia when I was very young. I just landed there and I thought, this is it. This is my other place. I want to live here. I kind of get it. I didn't hang anything else on it, you know, apart from the poets when I started reading and so on. And I'm still going back there, and if I could, I'd live half the year there.
Yeah, and you do often.
I do as much as I can manage. But that's also true of Paris and New York, of cities, you know. So I think my problem, I suppose, is I can't remember the quote now, but it's a wonderful quote about somebody talking about Kinsella, who was a great poet of place, but never hung a mythology on the place. You know, he went to Kerry, he wrote about a Kerry that was not mythologized. He went to Carrow, wrote, I think the best poem in English I've ever read about Connamara is Kinsella's Carrow, for example, and he wasn't from there at all.
Yeah.
It's a great love poem to his wife Eleanor as well, actually.
So I suppose there's a big difference between appropriation and just the personal response to it.
Exactly, Marina. I think you've hit it there, actually.
Yeah. It's a delicate thing, though, isn't it? Because it can
I think
shift
the
over.
true is, yes, it can be. There's a lot of appropriation, cultural appropriation going on everywhere.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think you do have a right to go in and respond to anywhere you like, you know.
Of course, yeah.
But when we were young, singing was our bugbear, because, you know, can you imagine? Dear God. Not sing, but the notion that everyone was a noble savage of some sort, you know, kind of savage. And so we used to write postcards to one another when I was in college about how we do be out drinking pints and smoking, not me now, you understand, and so on in the long evenings after sound, because what else would we be doing? But actually, when you read Singh on his reports, which I've only become familiar with recently, and you can see the originals in the library of the wonderful archive of the National Gallery, as well as the original notebooks of the illustrator for those reports for the Manchester Guardian, for whom my husband Steve worked, when it was the Guardian. And when you read those reports of Singh's, they're fantastic. They are absolutely real. They absolutely reflect the place, as do the wonderful notebooks of Jack B. Yeats, who got paid a lot more than Singh, much to Singh's disgust. They only paid him pennies for the writer. And so you know, you can do, I mean, we leave the playwright where we leave it at the moment.
That's interesting, because, you know, well, obviously, you know, for some of the students here who might be from elsewhere, you know, the Playboy of the Western world is considered one of the great classics of Irish literature.
And it is.
It is, but if you're from Connamara,
it's
maybe
just not.
it isn't.
It's just not what our life was.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful defence Yeats is supposed to have made. Corkery accused Singh of being a faker. I mean, I love Singh, as you know, of being a faker of peasant speech. And Yeats' response to that was, well, yes, it is probably true that Mr. Yeats did not speak English like a peasant. But if Mr. Yeats had been a peasant, that's how he would have spoken. If Mr. Singh had been a peasant, that's how he would have spoken. So I thought that was a very fair summing up by Yeats for a change.
And I'm probably finish up with this, Mary. There's loads we could talk about, but and something I didn't mention in the introduction. I suppose the propensity for doom, which seems to have entered our fibres, you know, like during COVID, and we seem to be carrying that bit of despair and darkness out from that journey. I'm thinking of the Beckett line from Endgame. I say the earth is extinguished, so I never saw it lit.
Yeah. Well, that's very good.
I weep for happiness, etc. So I'm just because a lot of poems in the book are quite dark, actually. You know, capturing that sense of kind of world despair. I suppose something we're all kind of carrying with us.
Zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yeah, and I'm wondering. Not that, you know, nothing is trivial as well, but just the poet's take on that. I'd love to be hopeful.
I am hopeful.
Yeah.
I mean, I take the small moments.
Yeah.
You know. That said, I think my worry is far less about global warming. That's happening. There's no question about that. I'm a long-term environmentalist. But it's much more immediate, you know. I think we all know what we're talking about. Anybody who's seen the judgment and the Supreme Court, Sotomayor's dissent from the Supreme Court's decision in America has reason to know how serious the position we're in are, regardless of what you feel politically. And I think we're also entering an age when, you know, so much is going on in tweets. Just tweets. Not decisions, not discussions. Statements.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be aware, you know, that democracy is not something that's guaranteed. That's how I would see it, by any means. And I think we're at a very crucial stage here now, and I think we serve our kids badly by denying that. That said, I'm enormously hopeful. Things come in cycles.
Yeah. Well, maybe we've just had our 80-odd years of peace, you know?
I think so.
And you tend to take that for granted.
Yeah.
I mean, go back to the grandparents and the great-grandparents, it was all, you know, it was a pretty violent island, this place.
I think it's wonderful how far we've come. I spent a lot of time working in the north and with people who had been affected by the war, and I love going there and seeing how far we've come there. I know it's not perfect, I know all of that, but you know, it can work.
You kind of think, you know, you look at the history, the long view of the history of the world, and it does seem to be just invasion, appropriation of territories, savagery, annihilation of the indigenous population, and then it settles down for a while, and then it's the next wave.
Yeah, they're the ways we can do very little about, but we can sing and dance while we're going. You know, we're going. That's our job.
Yeah,
I feel.
that's the poet's job.
Could I finish with a poem?
Yeah.
A short because of the title of a wonderful book by Antonio Tabucci, I think, or Tabucci, if that's how you pronounce it. But also I take great liberties with José Saramago's book, which the title of which I remember. I take 2 or 3 images out of that. And I want to dedicate it to my husband Steve, who is English and is really hoping things go the right way today. Those prophets with their heads in the clouds, worshipping some gilt-edged god, descending to the underworld now and again to do business and shady deals, know nothing. Accountants and monopoly players don't live in the real world like children and the rest of us, Pereira maintains. One man saw it all happen. He tramped the hills, day in, day out, a plain man, feet on the ground. The first sign were the birds that accompanied him in border country, a circle of starlings singing. Then he saw a rift opening where England met Scotland. A deep growl and the air took fire, Pereira maintains. One morning the ground cracked open like an egg. He jumped back to his own side and the birds vanished. Next day he woke on a stone raft. Last spotted, they were somewhere near Finland. They'll be adrift for years, Pereira maintains, thanks to those gamblers with their fat fingers and our heads in the clouds.
Anything? No? Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I want to ask you, but I'm always interested in poems that are commissioned. And I think it must be a very difficult task to do it. And yet, you read the Lucky ones, and it's just such a wonderful poem. And how difficult, and it's quite unlike the other poems.
Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering how difficult
It's a
it
good
is,
question.
or how do you approach it?
That was probably one of the more difficult ones, because obviously it had to be real, but it also had to be formal. That was the first thing, and it had to be crafted, I suppose. And I did work hard on it, but and it had to reflect something, and it was nothing to do with me. I thought at the time, of course, it was to do with all of us. But yes, it's a particular thing, and particularly, you have to have an eye to that it's not that you're giving something of yourself, but it's not actually coming from your experience. It's coming from a collective. It's coming from a collective, I think, insofar as you can ever say that. That's how I saw it, at least. And then you get these gifts of the little boys or the images.
Yeah.
Thank you. You must be all exhausted.
Anybody else?
Any other questions?
And then there's somebody here in front as well after.
Mary, it's lovely to hear your voice again.
Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Just looking to talk a little bit more, maybe about Diana's regret.
Oh, yes. Well, I think one of the things, I won't say much but because people are tired, but one of the things about myth, and one of the things that's so wonderful about it, we were talking about this last night, is that it stays with you as you grow older. So an interpretation that you have of something in your 20s, when she's full of rage and pride, and you see it quite differently. You can see it quite differently at different stages in your life, whatever the myth is. So it's really about that. There's compassion, and now she has compassion. She realizes some actions you cannot undo. And I think it's about that, our powerlessness as well as our power. Effectively, power is a dangerous thing to wield, I suppose. I think that's as far as I can recall. Yeah. By the way, I want to really thank the people from Limerick who came. It's fantastic to see you all. Can't wait to chat.
Hi. I'm just kind of here to learn how to write, and sometimes the thing I struggle with the most is the title. And so I was just wondering how you came to the title, The Shark Nursery.
You're talking to the wrong woman. I'm terrible on time.
Great.
Thank you. Well, this one was easy because there was a headline in the paper. Oh. Never ignore them. If you've seen newspaper these days, it said something like Shark Nursery discovered, rare shark nursery discovered off the west coast of Ireland. But in fact, of course, it wasn't what we know as a shark at all. It was a fiogach, as I knew him as a child, the most reviled poor old fish in the sea. A thing that was always thrown back. And so the poem is built around how the little fiogach, how this little fella felt being suddenly called a shark.
You're not great.
It's also a metaphor for the web. For social media.
Same question.
Same question.
Is that it? Or is
Yeah, I think you must be tired. I want to thank everybody again who came, as well as the Kennys once more, and Dean, everybody here. and particularly to thank Marina.
Oh, that's a pleasure, Mary.